A glance that lasted a lifetime. The first time Keanu saw Sandra, she wasn't a superstar. Not to him, anyway. She wasn't the Hollywood name on every marquee or the face lighting up magazine covers. To him, she was just a light. A strange, rare kind of light that didn't try to shine. It just did, without force, without needing permission. It was 1993, the early days, the casting room for a movie that back then no one thought would matter. Speed. A thriller, some action, a bus, whatever. But Keanu wasn't focused on the script. He wasn't even focused on the audition, because Sandra had just walked in, and for a moment, just one, he forgot his lines. She smiled, polite, confident, but in her eyes there was this flicker of nerves, not fear. Just that raw honesty that Keanu always recognized in people who hadn't been ruined by fame yet. People who still laughed too loud and tripped over words when they were excited. She said something he didn't hear. Or maybe he did, but he was too focused on how her laugh lingered just a half-second longer than most people's. That's when he knew she wasn't like the others, and something inside him, a quiet place he never let people see, started to whisper. They worked well, too well. The chemistry was real, so real the director didn't even try to fake it. They shot take after take, but sometimes the camera just kept rolling after the scene was done because what they had couldn't be written. And in the moments between action and cut, Keanu saw pieces of her that no one else saw. She wasn't just pretty, she was present. When you spoke, she listened. When she laughed, it came from somewhere deep, like she'd waited her whole life for someone to make her laugh that way. But here's the thing about Keanu. He never chased. He never crossed lines. He had seen what love did in Hollywood, how it bloomed fast and died faster. So he just stayed close, a quiet friend, a shadow beside her spotlight. After filming, they hugged. She whispered, "You're so strange, but I like it." And he smiled. That Keanu smile that people always said was hiding something. It was. For Sandra, life moved fast after that. Offers, fame, spotlights, red carpets. But somehow, no matter where she went, Keanu kept showing up, never loud, never center stage. He was the friend who called when her dog died, the one who left flowers on set when she was sick, the one who waited after award shows just to make sure she got home safe. And when she won her first big award and people cheered, Keanu didn't clap. He just looked at her like he had that first day and nodded. Because what he felt wasn't a headline. It wasn't tabloid love. It was something quieter, deeper, like the way mountains love the wind without needing to move. Sandra wasn't blind to it. She felt it too sometimes, in the stillness between scenes, in the long car rides where no one said a word, in the way he remembered things she didn't even know she said. But she had walls, not ones built from ego, but from pain, from old heartbreaks, from the fear that maybe love wasn't made for people like her. And Keanu, he never tried to climb those walls. He just stood beside them, waiting, patient, a presence, a silent promise. Years passed. They both dated other people, smiled on red carpets, laughed in interviews. But every time their paths crossed, even in random charity events or late-night talk shows, people felt something. They joked about it, said they should have dated. Sandra laughed. "Keanu, he's too perfect, I'd mess it up." What she didn't say was that sometimes she wished she could be the kind of woman who didn't mess things up. But Keanu wasn't waiting for perfect. He was waiting for real. Then came the moment that changed everything. One rainy afternoon, years after their last film together, Sandra was driving through the canyon roads outside LA when her car suddenly skidded on a curve. It wasn't serious, just a spin and a scare. But it shook her, because for the first time in a long time, she realized how fragile life still was. She called one person. Not her manager. Not her best friend. Keanu. He didn't ask why. He didn't even say much. He just drove to her place. And when she opened the door, she didn't say hi. She just fell into his arms. And for the first time in over a decade, he held her like he didn't care who was watching. They didn't kiss. They didn't talk about it. They just sat in silence, two souls finally honest in their stillness. Later that night, as he was leaving, he looked back once. And in his eyes, she saw everything he'd never said. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. And she believed him. Not because he said it, but because he always had. The night the lights went out, It had been 2 months since that rainy night. 2 months since Sandra stood in Keanu's arms longer than she ever allowed herself to stay in anyone's. 2 months of late-night texts, most of them short, some with no words at all, just a photo of a half-eaten chocolate cake she made, or a blurry sunset she captured from her kitchen window. And each time Keanu responded with something simple, a quiet laugh, a "you always find the light," or sometimes just, "still here." Sandra didn't know what was happening, or maybe she did and it scared her, because she'd spent so much of her life building careful walls around her heart, walls made of sarcasm, work, and the quiet belief that real love either doesn't last or doesn't come without a script. But Keanu, he wasn't like the others. He didn't try to fix her, didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He just remained. And that kind of presence, consistent, patient, unflinching, was more terrifying than all the heartbreak she'd ever survived. One night, after wrapping a film that had drained her emotionally, Sandra stood alone on her balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights shimmer below her like stars scattered on pavement. The wind whispered across her skin, and for the first time in years, she whispered out loud to no one, "I'm tired of being strong all the time." She didn't expect a response. But the next morning, there was a small envelope at her front door. No name, no return address, just one sentence on thick, textured paper. "Strength doesn't mean being alone." She didn't need to guess who it was from. Later that day, she called him. "Did you break into my gate?" "I asked your gardener." "Bribed him with what?" "Philosophy and an old book." "Of course you did," she smiled. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. And just like that, her throat tightened, because how did he always know exactly when she was? That weekend, he invited her to his house. Not a party, not even dinner, just space, quiet. A night under the stars with no expectations. His home was like him, minimal, grounded, warm in ways that couldn't be bought or designed. Books were scattered everywhere, some on the floor, some on shelves, some stacked on the edge of his piano. She noticed a small framed photo near his bookshelf, a picture of them from the Speed set, laughing over a prop gone wrong. "You kept this?" she asked. He shrugged. "It reminds me of when we were still figuring life out." She stared at it for a long time. "I'm still figuring it out." "Good," he said, his voice soft. "Means you're alive." They sat outside, wrapped in old wool blankets, their breath visible in the cool air. The sky above them stretched endlessly, the stars like tiny promises. And then the power went out, just like that. Half the street fell into darkness. "No music, no phones, no lights," Sandra said with a smirk. "You planned this." Keanu chuckled. The universe did. For a long time, they just sat there, not speaking, not touching, just breathing in the silence. And in that moment, something shifted, not between them, but within Sandra. Because for once, there was no performance, no audience, no makeup, no clever banter, just the sound of their hearts beating under the stars. Raw, real. "Do you ever think about the what-ifs?" she asked quietly, her voice barely louder than the wind. Keanu didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, then looked at her, not through her, but into her, the way only he could. "All the time," he finally said. "But I also believe in timing, and in people coming back to you when they're ready." She turned away, but her voice cracked when she spoke again. "I think I've been ready for a long time. I was just scared." "I know," he whispered. "That's why I never asked you to be." And it hit her then, how many moments they'd let pass. How many times he'd stood beside her without asking for anything. How much love can exist in silence. That night, she didn't go home. She slept on his old leather couch, curled under his favorite blanket, with the scent of old books and cedar filling the room. And at some point in the middle of the night, she woke up to find him sitting on the floor beside her, reading. "You okay?" she mumbled, her voice groggy. "I just didn't want you to wake up alone." She didn't say anything. She just reached out her hand, and he took it, quietly, gently, like it was something sacred. And in that small, tender moment, a truth neither of them had dared speak began to breathe between them. Love didn't always have to roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it waited. And sometimes it arrived quietly, like a man who read by moonlight just to make sure you weren't afraid when morning came. The letter she was never meant to read. It had been 3 weeks since that night, the night she didn't go home, the night she finally let go of the tension she'd worn like armor for years. And yet nothing had been spoken, not clearly, not directly, not the way people in love were supposed to. There were no declarations, no dramatic gestures, no sudden shifts in rhythm. Keanu still texted her once a day, sometimes twice, but never pushed for more. Sandra still made excuses to swing by his place. She'd bring him rare teas, old scripts, or books she knew he already owned just to see him smile. And still, neither of them said it. Not with words, but everything else screamed it. One afternoon, as spring crept gently into Los Angeles and the city began to thaw from its quiet winter mood, Sandra found herself in Keanu's home again. This time, he wasn't there. He had left early that morning for a charity event in Vancouver, and she'd agreed to water his plants while he was away, an excuse he hadn't even needed to make. She wandered the halls slowly, sipping lukewarm coffee, her eyes tracing the familiar details. The single vinyl record on the player paused mid-song, the stack of old notebooks held together by a leather strap on the corner of his writing desk. The faded Polaroids clipped to a string along the wall, most of them candid, most of them of places, but a few of her. One in particular was from a quiet dinner years ago where she had laughed so hard wine came out of her nose. She didn't even know someone had taken the photo. She reached for the notebooks. She didn't mean to open them. She didn't mean to read. But the leather strap slipped, and one of the notebooks thudded softly to the floor, flipping open in the middle like it wanted to be seen. She hesitated. Then, as if something larger than her was guiding the moment, she sat down, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the first page. August 14th. She told a joke today, something about bad coffee and aliens, and I laughed harder than I should have. Not because it was funny, but because it was her. Sometimes I think I feel too much around her, so I quiet myself. I become still. I become small. Not because I want to disappear, but because I don't want to overwhelm the space she fills so effortlessly. She doesn't know how bright she is. And I pray she never dims herself just to be loved. Sandra froze, the air around her thickened. The silence pressed against her ears like a heartbeat. She flipped another page. September 3rd. She wore blue today. The kind of blue that makes you forget you're sad. She smiled at someone else, and I felt jealousy rise, not the angry kind, just the aching kind. The kind that reminds you you're not entitled to anything you haven't been brave enough to ask for. But I'm not brave with her, I just wait. Because love like this shouldn't be rushed. It should be given room to breathe, to grow, to become real on its own time. Tears welled in her eyes. She shouldn't have read it, but at the same time, how could she not? It wasn't a love letter meant for her. It was a journal of honesty, a quiet confessional from a man who had given so much of himself without asking for anything in return. Page after page, entry after entry, years of moments she had never known he remembered, times when she thought he was simply being kind but now understood he was loving her the only way he knew how. Without demand, without pressure, without noise. She closed the book softly and pressed it to her chest. And for the first time in years, she felt a kind of grief. Not because she had lost something, but because she realized how long she had refused to claim something that had been gently offered to her over and over again. That evening, Keanu returned unexpectedly early. A delayed flight had been rerouted, and without warning he walked through the door, rain on his shoulders and a warm laugh in his throat. But the second he saw her, he stopped. She stood in the hallway, barefoot, hair a mess, journal in hand, tears fresh on her cheeks. He didn't need to ask. And she didn't need to apologize. I wasn't looking for anything, she said quietly, but I found you in every word. He nodded slowly, his eyes calm but unreadable. You weren't supposed to see that. I know, she whispered, but I'm glad I did. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was heavy, full of unspoken things begging to breathe. I kept waiting for you to say something, she continued, voice trembling. But now I understand. You were already saying it, just not the way I was used to hearing it. He stepped closer, each movement deliberate, like he didn't want to startle the moment. I've loved you quietly, he said, because I didn't want my love to ever be louder than your healing. Her breath caught. No one had ever said something like that to her. Ever. I don't need a script, Sandra, he continued, or the perfect moment or a label or fireworks. I just need to be where you are, however that looks. She reached for his hand, and for the first time didn't pull away. I'm not perfect, she warned. I'm messy and tired and afraid half the time. Good, he smiled softly. So am I. That night there were no grand kisses, no sudden passion, just two people sitting side by side on a quiet couch, holding hands for the first time like it was an act of revolution. Because for them it was. And as the moonlight spilled through the windows, casting shadows across the floor, Sandra leaned her head on Keanu's shoulder and whispered, "You don't have to love me quietly anymore." He looked down at her, eyes full of a peace he hadn't felt in years. "Okay," he said simply. And for the first time in his life, the silence inside him didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home. The day she nearly said goodbye. Life has a way of testing love not through storms, but through quiet, persistent winds. Those long, unremarkable days when nothing dramatic happens, but everything still shifts beneath the surface. After that night when Sandra found the journal and everything between them changed. Not with a kiss, but with a truth, they began to quietly build something real. Not a relationship defined by headlines or grand gestures, but something softer, more sacred, hidden from the noise of the world that always demanded too much of them. They didn't announce anything. They didn't need to. Friends noticed subtle changes. The way Keanu would linger a little longer at rap parties, only leaving when Sandra did. The way Sandra, who was once so fiercely independent she couldn't stand being walked to her car, now let Keanu hold her hand as they strolled past photographers, never in public view, always behind the scenes. They had carved out a space for themselves that felt untouched by the glitter and illusion of fame. But even the safest spaces can tremble when the past knocks too hard. It was a Thursday afternoon, just a normal day. Sandra was driving to a late meeting with a producer, her phone buzzing with unread messages, her mind filled with contracts, deadlines, and the mental fatigue of being a woman who had learned to carry too much. She pulled up at a red light and looked to her right, and there he was. Brian's, not Keanu, but Brian Marks. The man who had once broken her into so many pieces, she spent 2 years pretending she didn't bleed. He didn't see her. He was standing on the sidewalk, laughing with a woman who looked exactly like the version of Sandra he used to mold her into, glamorous, plastic, performative. Sandra's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The light turned green, but she didn't move. Cars honked behind her, but she didn't flinch. All she could see was the ghost of who she used to be, the girl who smiled through gaslighting, who apologized for her dreams, who silenced her instincts just to make a man comfortable. When she finally pulled away, her heart was racing so fast she had to pull over and sit still. Breathe, breathe again, but something inside her had cracked open, not because she still loved Brian, not even close, but because seeing him again reminded her how far she hadn't come. How, despite everything, part of her still felt like that scared, small woman in a pretty dress. She didn't tell Keanu. Not at first. Because how do you explain to someone like him, a man who moved through life with stillness and kindness, that you sometimes still doubt your own worth? That even when someone loves you well, your scars still whisper lies? So she pulled away. Not cruelly, not dramatically, she just became busy, canceled one dinner, rescheduled another, took on a last-minute film project in New York. Keanu didn't push, he just noticed. The text messages came less often. The check-ins felt more formal. The warmth between them cooled, not frozen, just paused, like the air before a storm that doesn't know if it's coming or passing. And then came the charity gala. She hadn't planned to go, but her agent insisted. "One appearance," he said. "Smile, pose, donate, leave." She wore black, sleek, elegant, guarded. Keanu wasn't supposed to be there, but fate is funny like that. She spotted him the moment she entered the grand hall. He stood near a bookshelf in the corner, dressed in his usual understated black suit, sipping something clear and sparkling. He hadn't shaved. His hair was slightly longer. He looked like a painting caught between dusk and shadow. Their eyes met across the room. And suddenly, the noise of the gala vanished. He didn't smile. She didn't wave. They just looked at each other for what felt like an eternity. When she finally made her way toward him, her heels soft on the carpeted floor, she wasn't sure what she would say. But she didn't need to speak. He did. "Are you okay?" It was the first thing he said, the only thing he ever really needed to say, and that's what undid her. She wasn't expecting anger or coldness, but she also wasn't prepared for kindness. Not after ghosting him without reason. Not after stepping back when he had done nothing but stay. "I saw someone," she whispered, "someone from before." He nodded, "And it made you feel like you were still that version of yourself." Her breath caught, "Yes." He looked at her with a gaze so gentle it hurt. "Sandra, we all have ghosts. I just wish you'd let me stand beside you when yours come knocking. I didn't want you to think I was broken." "I already know you're broken," he said quietly, "and I still choose you." That's when her tears came. Right there in the corner of a gala surrounded by flashing lights and expensive silence, she cried, not for the pain, but for the way he made space for her to feel it. He didn't reach for her. He didn't pull her into a scene. He just stood still, his presence a blanket, his eyes a confession. "I've always been afraid I'm too much," she said. "And I've always been afraid I'm not enough," he replied. And that's when they understood. Their love wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished or poised or ready for the cover of a magazine. It was messy and scarred and raw. It had been tested, delayed, almost lost. But it was still there. After the gala, they didn't go to dinner. They didn't go to his place or hers. They drove aimlessly through the streets of Los Angeles, windows down, radio low. And somewhere between the empty hills and the city lights, she reached across the center console and took his hand. And this time it wasn't shaky. It wasn't unsure. It was a choice. "I don't want to run anymore," she said. He didn't answer, he just squeezed her hand. And that night they parked the car in front of her house, sat in silence for a while, then fell asleep in the front seats with their hands still intertwined. Two souls who had wandered long enough to realize they had finally come home. The promise he never said out loud. The world didn't notice the shift, but they felt it. The ones closest to Keanu and Sandra, the ones who had watched them pass each other over the years like two planets caught in the same orbit, felt something had finally clicked into place. Not loudly, not with fanfare or gossip column headlines, but with the quiet reverence of two people who had finally stopped looking over their shoulders and started walking forward, together. Their relationship, if it could be called that, didn't have a name. It didn't require one. It existed like a breath shared between two souls, private and real. She never said she was his, he never asked. But they both began showing up for each other in the kind of way that made it clear to anyone paying attention, this was not casual. Sandra started cooking again, something she hadn't done since her mother passed. Not for show, not for guests, but just for the comfort of feeding someone who stayed. Keanu, in return, started leaving his motorcycle keys in her foyer without thinking about it. He even kept a spare toothbrush under her sink, though neither of them spoke about it. These were not bold declarations. These were quiet integrations, the kind of small choices that turn strangers into constants. One Sunday morning, as light crept through the curtains and Los Angeles still slept under the haze of spring fog, Sandra woke to the sound of piano music coming from the living room. Not a full song, just a few notes, gentle and broken like thoughts being worked out one key at a time. She walked barefoot down the hallway, the floorboards cool beneath her, and found Keanu at the piano, wearing an old gray t-shirt, his hair still messy from sleep, his eyes closed as his fingers wandered through a melody that didn't yet have a name. She didn't speak, she just watched, and in that moment something inside her broke in the most beautiful way, because she realized she had never watched a man create something purely for himself, without needing to be seen or praised or validated. He wasn't playing for her. He was playing because something inside him needed to feel, and the piano was how he spoke when words wouldn't do. And she realized, with a depth that frightened her, that she would spend the rest of her life just wanting to make sure he never forgot how to be that soft. Later that day, they sat on her porch, sipping tea and watching the sky change color, when Keanu said something that stayed with her long after the sun disappeared. "You know, I've never believed in soulmates," he said, not looking at her. "But I do believe in echoes, like certain people carry a frequency that resonates with yours even before you meet them, and when you finally do, you don't fall in love, you just remember." She turned to him, startled by the intimacy of the thought. "What do you remember when you look at me?" He paused, then softly, "Peace," and the sound of silence finally making sense. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't want to cry, not now. Not because she was sad, but because no one had ever made her feel seen without making her feel small. And Keanu, he had this way of holding her like a whisper, like she might shatter if he was too loud. The days that followed were slow and precious. A quiet walk through a bookstore downtown, a spontaneous road trip to Ajay where they sat under a blanket of stars and shared secrets they had never told anyone else. She told him about the abortion she'd never spoken about publicly. He told her about the daughter he'd lost before she was born. No pity. No saving, just presence. And then came the interview. It wasn't supposed to matter, just another promotional appearance for her latest film. She wore the usual smile, answered the usual questions, but when the host, trying to be clever, joked, "You and Keanu have been dancing around each other for years. When are you finally going to give the people what they want?" She laughed as she always did, deflected as she always had. But that night when she came home, she didn't walk in with the same ease. She looked at him, already there, reading quietly on her couch, and for the first time her voice shook. "I'm tired of pretending," she whispered. He looked up, eyes steady. "So stop." "I don't know how," she said, laughing through the ache. "It's been my whole life, pretending to be fine, pretending to be unbothered, pretending to not need anyone." He stood slowly, walked to her, and placed a hand gently on her cheek. "Then let me help you remember, every day, if you'll let me." She nodded, and for the first time he kissed her. Not urgently, not passionately, but reverently, like he had waited long enough and was finally given permission to exhale. And when their lips parted, he didn't say, "I love you." He didn't need to. Because love, for him, had never been a sentence. It had always been a choice made over and over again, quietly, gently, fully. That night, as they fell asleep in each other's arms, something shifted again, not in the world, not in headlines, but in the core of two people who had finally allowed themselves to be seen. He didn't make her whole. She didn't complete him. They were both still broken in places. But for the first time, they stopped hiding those cracks from each other. And that was enough. The morning he didn't let go. Time did what it always does. It moved, even when they wanted to stay still. But in those months that followed their quiet kiss, time no longer felt like a thief. It became a soft witness, a companion. The days they once let slip past them in silence were now filled with presence, and the spaces between them no longer felt like distance, but rhythm. Keanu and Sandra didn't live together, yet they rarely spent a night apart. Their homes, once filled with the loneliness of routine, now held the evidence of a gentle entangling. Her books on his coffee table, his jacket on the back of her chair, one shared key between them that didn't need a drawer to belong. What they had built wasn't flashy. It didn't demand to be seen or validated, but it was real. So real, in fact, that even when Sandra began shooting overseas for 3 months, neither of them panicked. There were no games, no need for constant reassurance. They had long passed the threshold of needing to define what they were. They simply were. They had become each other's silence, each other's Sunday morning, each other's space to fall apart and not be asked to fix anything. But even the strongest of loves is tested not by distance, but by the fragile, unexpected moments that life throws when we least expect it. It happened on a Tuesday. Keanu had just wrapped a quiet lunch with an old friend when he received the call. A journalist, not one of the tabloid kind, but one of the thoughtful ones, had reached out to his team. They had been working on a retrospective about grief and fame, and someone had mentioned the passing of Keanu's daughter all those years ago. It wasn't an expose. It wasn't meant to hurt. But the way they spoke of it, as a footnote, as a quiet tragedy boxed into a paragraph, sent something spiraling inside him. He hadn't thought about her like this in a long time. He remembered her every day, yes. But to see her turned into a headline, reduced to a quote, it wrecked him. And he didn't know how to explain that kind of pain to anyone. He didn't go home. He drove without knowing where. The city blurred past him, quiet cafes, dog walkers, red lights he didn't remember stopping at. And when the sky began to dim, he finally parked at the beach. The same beach where years ago he had sat alone after burying her mother. He sat there again now, elbows on knees, head bowed, waves crashing in the distance. And for the first time in years, he felt like the man he thought he had left behind, empty, untethered, full of love with nowhere to put it. Sandra found him there 3 hours later. She didn't call, didn't text. She just knew, because that's what love does when it's real. It senses what logic can't. She walked toward him barefoot, the sand cold under her feet, the wind tugging at her sleeves. He didn't look up when she approached, but she sat beside him anyway, close enough to let her warmth seep into his side. They didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was cracked, barely there. They wrote about her like she was just something that happened to me. Sandra didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say she was sorry or that it would be okay. She just took his hand and placed it over her heart. She wasn't something that happened, she whispered. She is something that lives here, in you, in everything you do, in every quiet kindness you give. He broke then, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the kind of grief that only a man who's been holding it too long can release. And Sandra, instead of trying to hold him together, simply let him fall apart. Because sometimes love is not about fixing. Sometimes love is about sitting in the wreckage and saying, "I'll be here when you're ready to rebuild." That night they didn't go back to her house or his. They checked into a small oceanfront motel, the kind with thin walls and curtains that never quite closed. They curled into each other on the tiny bed, limbs tangled, breath synced, and for the first time in their love story, Sandra spoke what had long been waiting on the tip of her tongue. "I love you, Keanu." He didn't respond right away. But then he turned to her, his hand gently brushing her temple, his eyes clear in the dim light. "I've loved you in 1,000 silent ways," he said, "but hearing you say it out loud, it feels like finally coming home." And the next morning, when she woke to find the space beside her empty, she felt her heart race, until she saw him outside, barefoot on the balcony, a mug in his hand, watching the waves. She walked up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her head against his back. "You're still here," she murmured. He smiled, turned, and kissed her forehead. "I'm never leaving," he said. It wasn't a proposal. There were no rings, no cameras, no promises spoken for show. But it was everything. Because sometimes the greatest vows are the ones made in the ordinary mornings, the ones whispered over coffee and quiet waves, in the hearts of two people who took their time and still chose each other in the end. And the world, it never quite knew the depth of what they had. It still doesn't. Because some love stories aren't meant to be performed, some are meant to be protected. Keanu loved Sandra quietly, yes. But in that quiet was a forever louder than any words could say.